let's get started. Welcome, everybody. This is the January 2024 edition of the Lobster Management Board. So welcome, everyone. A couple of things to get started here. The first, we will start with the agenda. Are there any additions, deletions, anything with the agenda that anybody wants to offer? Looking around the room here, not seeing anyone raising their hand. Is there anyone online? Does not seem like there's anyone online either. Great. Okay, so we will consider the agenda. Actually, do I need a motion for that? Okay. Okay. Yes, thanks. It takes me a minute to warm up here. Are there any objections to approving the agenda as submitted? Please raise your hand, either real hand or virtual. No hands at the table, no hands online. We will consider the agenda approved by consent. Okay, next up is the approval of the proceedings from the October 2023 meeting. Are there any corrections? I see Allie Murphy in the back. Go ahead, Allie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a quick correction on page 30 of the minutes from the annual meeting in 2023. I misspoke and said the date at which, or the date that the line that we drew in the sand for the date for allocations that would be considered over the area 2 and 3 ownership caps. I misspoke and said that was May 1st, 2023, and in its place, it should be May 1st, 2022. I believe staff have that correction.
Great, thank you, Allie. It's just folks in the room, make sure you're, well, no, it's pretty loud, so I think it's okay. All right, so we have that correction. Anyone else with any corrections? Thank you, Allie, for that. Anyone else with any corrections to the proceedings? Please raise your hand. Not seeing any in the room, nobody online. So I'll look around the room. Are there any objections to approving the October 2023 proceedings as modified today? Please raise your hand. No hands in the room. And looking online, no hands online. So we'll consider the proceedings approved with the modification offered by Allie Murphy. All right, thank you folks very much. Next, we'll go to public comment. So this is an opportunity to make a public comment on anything that is not on the agenda. So important distinction there. If it's on the agenda today, please hold your comment until we get to that part of the agenda. But if there's anything that isn't on the agenda, anyone in the public wishes to address, now is your opportunity. So is there anyone here in the room looking for hands? Not seeing anyone in the room. We do have one hand online. So it's Stephen Smith. So we'll make sure we've got you unmuted and you can go ahead and make your comment. You should be good to go, Stephen. We're not hearing you if you're saying anything, Stephen.
Stephen, you just need to unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone button and turning it green.
How is this?
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. My comment and a question is a general question. The commercial lobster Gulf of Maine area between Cape Cod Bay and the Canadian border has no effort control aside from an 800 trap per license holder limit. The average in Massachusetts alone is approximately 360 traps per license holder, which allows a greater than a double increase in effort anytime in the future. This is more than enough to counter any trap control in the outer Cape Cod area and the EEZ area combined. It will also keep the minimum size increases at a first-time molt into the legal size. There is much too much effort that is able to be applied to the fishery in this particular area. So the question would be then, will the ASMFC address this problem? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the comment. There was a question there. I don't know if, I don't know that anyone is ready to speak to that question, but Tony looks like she's going for her mic, maybe. Hang on one second, sir. Okay, sorry, we just did a little sidebar here. So we have your comment, just kind of on the fly here. There are no additional, if your question was about effort control, there's no action right now for additional effort control. But we have your comment. We will try and digest that a little more after the meeting, but that's our comment for the time being. Thank you for that. Okay, let's keep moving along here. Next up is a report from the Lobster Technical Committee. This was the request that the board made about getting a little bit of information on the lobster resource and the fishery near the northern edge of Georges Bank. We have Tracy Pugh on the line. And so Tracy, whenever you are ready to go, please feel free to take it away.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am going to sort of briefly review the key points in the memo that we provided. And this again was the task for looking for information on the northern edge of Georges Bank. If we could click the slide, please. So this is in response to the New England Fisheries Management Council's potential action. They're considering opening scallop access to a portion of closed area 2. Specifically, the area that they're talking about is within a currently closed habitat management area. And if you can go to the next slide, we have a map here to give you a little bit of orientation. So this is the northern edge of Georges Bank. And the gold box here is highlighting the habitat management area in which they are considering opening scallop access. So next, please. So essentially the task was for the TC to provide some information to help characterize any potential impacts that allowing scallop access to this area might have on the lobster resource and the lobster fishery. So, next, please. So specifically, the board gave us several topics to address with this. The topics were to provide information on the presence and abundance of lobsters, including ovigerous lobsters in and around the northern edge by month or season, to provide information on lobster fishery effort in and around the northern edge, again by month or season, to provide potential information on potential impacts of mobile gear on the lobster population in this area, to provide information on habitat type and depth preferences of lobsters, which can inform our understanding of the lobster resource in the northern edge if there's limitations in available data, and to provide information on whether the current reporting by Area 3 vessels is representative or if it's an underestimate of the effort in the northern edge area and how future requirements might impact our data availability. So the TC met via webinar, and we discussed the data sources that we thought would be useful to address these points. But unfortunately, we did not have enough time, or in some cases, we didn't actually have access to the data that we're going to need to conduct these analyses. So what I'm going to do here is provide a review of the data sources that we identified and cover a little bit of a couple preliminary results we were able to put together, and then what we think we can do in the future to provide you with additional information. So next, please. So data availability. So specifically within the habitat management area, we think we can look, there's going to be harvester reported data from the federal VTRs. There's going to be a little bit of tracker data. So the Massachusetts fleet came online with tracker data about 9 months ago, I think. So we have a little bit of tracker data that might be informative. There's a potential that there's federal observer data, although I think the most recent data is from 2015. There's the potential that the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, or CFRF, they have a study fleet, and we may be able to request data and have a look at those data to inform effort and catch characteristics. There's a potential that we could look at tagging study data. There was a recent collaboration between Atlantic Offshore Lobster, New Hampshire Fish and Game, and Maine DMR. So we can look at the tagging study data that came from that work. And of course, we have the Science Center spring and fall trawl survey locations. So they are going to be relatively limited because only a couple of trawls will fall within the specific area. Next, please. So for information that's not maybe exactly in the habitat management area, but really nearby, everything that I previously mentioned. And then there's also a Coonamessett Farm Foundation seasonal scallop bycatch survey. And we think that this Coonamessett Farm survey data is going to be particularly useful for looking at seasonality of lobster in the scallop dredge skier and understanding what that bycatch looks like. And then also whether or not there's any damage induced by that particular gear type. All right, next, please. So for some preliminary results, I mentioned that we took a brief look at the tracker data. So a very preliminary analysis of the Massachusetts tracker data was available to us. Again, this is about 9 months. They activated in May of 2023. And if you look at the map here, what we're looking at is the NIMS statistical areas in red. The gray boxes are the 10-minute squares. And in Area 561, the yellow box there is the habitat management area that we're talking about. And then those pink hatched boxes are the 10-minute squares in which we took a look at the tracker data. So in that area, there's definitely some activity. We had at least 5 vessels with trips in that area, and it represented at least 34 trips. But we wanted to note here that Massachusetts boats represent only about 10% of the effort in Area 561, based on a preliminary look at our VCR data. And just to note, the memo said that we looked at 8 10-minute squares. It's actually 17 squares, as you can see in the map there. So there's definitely activity in the area, and we need to do a little bit more to understand a little bit better what that activity is. Next, please. So we could also look at some previous work, and information indicates that lobsters in this region tend to be very large, and the sex ratio tends to be pretty female skewed. We spent some time looking at this back in, I think, 2012 and in 2015, and we're referencing a TC memo to the board that was 2015, where we looked into impacts of open and closed area 2 to mobile gear. And I think that memo was attached at the end of the memo we provided to you. The Coonamessett Farm data, there were a couple of final reports available, and we had a look at that. And the lobsters that they're seeing retained in those scallop dredges are definitely vulnerable to significant damage. They observed 783 lobsters, and 34% of those had lethal damage. Another 27% exhibited moderate but sublethal damage from the scallop gear. We do see damage to lobsters from scallop, and other gear tends to be worse for recently molted lobsters. So if they haven't fully hardened that shell yet, they're going to be more susceptible to damage from scallop or other mobile gear. And again, this is referencing our 2015 TC memo, along with an appendix that was provided in Addendum 20. And so it's important to note here that any kind of seasonality of interactions with lobsters and mobile gear is going to be important to the level of impact on the resource itself. And finally, again, from the Coonamessett Farm surveys, they did see higher bycatch in those scallop surveys that occurred near the habitat management area during the summer and the fall season. And this was primarily driven by a large increase in the females in the catch. Next, please. So the last topic question, I guess, was whether or not the data that we're getting in terms of reporting data is going to be representative of actual effort in the Northern Edge area. So we wanted to point out that while nearly all of the vessels that are active in the area have been reporting VTRs since 2013, there are definite limitations to using VTR data in terms of the spatial resolution. So for the most part, vessels are reporting a single latitude longitude instead of coordinates for each trawl that they fish. So it does limit our ability to look at a trawl by trawl kind of effort and spatial footprint. And of course, there's confidentiality challenges when it comes to presenting or displaying any of these data. We think that the upcoming implementation of the federal EVTRs is going to improve the coverage and possibly the data quality here. But we wanted to highlight that the implementation of the trackers on the federally permitted vessels is going to be a huge improvement in our ability to understand the spatial footprint and the timing of when and where effort is occurring. Those confidentiality challenges will likely remain in terms of how we can present or share the data, but the tracker data will be a big improvement once it gets all online. All right, next, please. So for next steps, the TC can examine the seasonal catch and effort in the vicinity of the area. We can do this by looking more in depth at the harvester reporting data for recent years at the 10-minute square level. This is going to require a data request to National Marine Fisheries Service so that we can get the data to capture the seasonality and the spatial resolution. And again, there's likely going to be some confidentiality issues in what we can present, but we can certainly look at it in detail. And we can also look at size composition and sex ratios for lobsters in the vicinity. So we can use the CFRF study fleet data for this, the Federal Observer data, and we can also look at the Science Center's trawl survey information. We think that some information is also likely going to be available from the Coonamessett Farm Foundation bycatch surveys, and both of these things are going to require additional data requests. Next, please. So we can do these things, but they clearly are going to take a little bit of time. So we have to do data requests to National Marine Fisheries Service and to Coonamessett Farms in order to get the data at the resolution we need. We are unclear what the turnaround time on that request would be. Hopefully it would be relatively quick. I did want to note that the TC members do have a fair amount of time and effort commitments in preparation for the stock assessment coming up. We have data workshops for the assessment that are going to be taking place in February. So we will have a little bit of time conflict there. And it's our understanding that the New England Fisheries Management Council is going to be meeting in April. Ideally, we would be able to provide some input in time for this meeting. So depending on the turnaround time on getting these data, we think that we should be able to have information provided to the board by late March. And with that, again, this was just a brief overview of what's in the memo. So I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Tracy. So good report from the technical committee. Did some nice work collecting the available information that's out there, a little bit of preliminary analysis. So I think the job here for the board is to kind of figure out the priority of this work amongst all of the other priorities that the technical committee has. If we want them to kind of move forward, there's kind of a date critical here of April for the New England Council meeting to have, anything we ask for, have it be relevant for their deliberations. So just wanted to kind of summarize that so folks, could have a sense of where we're driving at with this agenda item. Let's start with some questions for Tracy. So look around the table first. Questions for Tracy? None at the table. Any online, Caitlin? Okay. David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question, but I just want to make a point that first off, thank you very much, Tracy, for an excellent report, and thank the members of the committee that participated in it. The last time I was involved in this issue was a number of years ago with when I worked for AOLA, and it came up at the New England Council, and we were opposed to it. I'm just stating history here. We were opposed to it because of the damage rates on lobsters. As you can see from Tracy's report, damage rates can be as high as 60%, both moderate and lethal damage to lobsters. And of equal, if not greater, concern to us was the fact that 80% of the lobsters at certain times of year are ovigerous in this area. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to be super cautious and have the commission go on record with a strong letter on the issue when we eventually get to it. And I guess a question for you, or Mr. Chairman, or the staff, how will we formalize that recommendation? In other words, our meeting isn't until May. So what's going to be the process we're going to follow? Thank you.
Good question, David. I don't think that one's for Tracy, maybe for Tony or Caitlin. Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think what we can do is provide this preliminary report to the New England Council, and then have the TC work as quickly as possible, because I know that this is an agenda item that I believe is on their February meeting. Mr. Reed probably will correct me if I'm wrong. And we want to make sure that we get our input in a thorough fashion to the council so that they have all the information when they're considering their management document.
Thank you, Tony. What's that? Okay, got it. So a couple of hands around the table. Let's take care of the one online. So Eric, go ahead. Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your report. For our meeting next week, the Northern Edge is not on that agenda, but it will be for sure on our April agenda. That's the 16th through the 18th of April. But another milestone is the Habitat and Scallop Committee are meeting jointly on March 27th. And ideally, it would be good to have as much information as possible for that meeting. That's March 27th. So that's our schedule. So see what you can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. No, that's helpful to kind of understand the timeline a little bit more. I had a couple of hands. So Ray, I had you first, and I'll come to you, Pat.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe Tracy can answer this question, but a number of years ago, we were sitting at this table. I believe Bill Adler was still a commissioner for Massachusetts, and we had an issue with the otter trawlers wanting to tow out there. And if my recollection serves me well, 70% of those lobsters on the Northern Edge are egg-bearing females. And another question I would have was, I believe Bob Glenn gave us a presentation about with the wind and tidal shifts and all, and currents, that those egg-bearing lobsters, when they drop their eggs, there's this biological where they're up on the surface and they drop down through the different depths, and all those eggs end up in the Gulf of Maine. And we're pressed right now in the Gulf of Maine. We know what the young of the year stock looks like. So I was wondering if Tracy could bring me up to speed on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Tracy, that definitely sounds like it's in your wheelhouse. So please feel free to offer Ray a response.
Yeah, certainly it's in the wheelhouse, but maybe a little rusty. So I think that in both 2012 and 2015 are old memos that I found that the TC put together in response to the council considering openings to mobile gear in that closed area too. I think in portions a little further south than what we're talking about here, but still in that closed area too. And those memos did certainly talk about the concentrations of large mature females up on top of the bank in the shallow water in the summer and the fall. Timing wise, yeah, a lot of those would probably be egg bearing. I don't have the percentages right off, but we can certainly do some additional digging and see if we can find information to be a little bit more informative there. And in terms of the larval distribution, that one I'm going to have to say that it's not fresh in my head, and I would have to do a little bit of digging with the TC's help and see if we can get a better answer for that. It's certainly plausible, but I don't want to answer right off.
Thank you, Tracy. Anything else, Ray?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, next up is Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tracy, thanks for that update from the TC. It's clear that there's a lot more conversations that the TC must have, and I think some of the points that David and Ray King just brought up with some of the resource issues, I think really highlights the fact that I think where you're going is we need to prioritize what some of this work is going to look like. And I appreciate the New England Council Chair giving us a little bit of a clarity on that deadline, right? So March is coming up pretty quickly. So I think from my standpoint, I'd like to highlight two areas that the TC needs to focus on for goals. And that is information on the presence and abundance of lobsters, including ovigerous lobsters, in and around the northern edge by month and by season, and the lobster fishery efforts in and around the northern edge by month and by season. So those two things overlaid, I think, really give us a really good picture of potential impacts of allowing the Scarlet Fleet in there to the lobster and that interaction with the lobster resource. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent, thank you, Pat. And so, yeah, we've kind of transitioned into providing advice and recommendations here. So thanks for that, Pat. Let's see, Dan, I had you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Pat Kelleher's request that the TC look at by month and by season the incidence of lobsters, and especially ovigerous lobsters in this area. But I have a process question as well. So if the council is going to make a decision before this board meets again, would the comment period not be open so that this board could take a formal position on something at its next meeting and submit that to the regional administrator for his consideration about whatever the council would have approved?
Okay, so it sounds the question is a good one. I'm not sure who to go to for an answer. Okay, let's start with the chair of the New England Council. So Eric Reed, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the question, Mr. McKiernan. We're not taking final action in April. We're still developing alternatives at that point, but early and often is what I would suggest on comments. But final action isn't going to be till much later in 2024, if that should actually happen then. So that's the timeline.
Excellent, thank you, Eric. So it sounds like there's some time there. Great. Tony.
And the rationale for putting this information together is so that the council can weave some of this information into their document that they put out for public comment, so that everybody is informed of the full scope of the issue.
Perfect. Okay, so we got we provided some clear guidance to the technical committee on areas to focus. Oh, sorry, Tracy, go ahead.
Thanks. So I just wanted to briefly expectation managing a little bit. So for the VTR data, that's going to provide us with catch data, certainly, and effort. With the 10-minute square resolution, getting really good monthly or seasonal abundance estimates is a little bit more of a challenge, because we can certainly use the catch data to inform that, but abundance is typically something we think of as being the fishery independent surveys, and the Science Center's trawl survey is just simply a spring and fall. So we've used that in the past in addition to catch data to sort of infer things, but that's kind of the best we can do with that. Additionally, in terms of getting really specific information in terms of where and when the eggers are there, that will again be a little bit of a challenge. That's obviously not going to be in the VTR data, because the VTR data is catch. It doesn't take into account discards. So for that, we're going to be reliant on any kind of observer programs in the area, or if the CFRF or a previous logbook program with, I think, AOLA and New Hampshire Fish and Game. Those will be the data sources we'll have to rely on for that. So it might be a little bit sparse, but we will certainly do everything we can to get a good picture of what's going on out there.
That's excellent, Tracy. Thank you for that clarification, and yeah, tempering the expectations on what the data can actually deliver. So appreciate that. But we also appreciate you, thinking on it and doing the best you can with what's available. Okay, let's look around the table. One more shot here. Dan, go ahead.
Just a comment. If there was ever a reason for vessel trackers and you needed an Exhibit A, this is it.
Good point, Dan. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we are going to move on. Just one comment. I want to get through these two technical committee reports, and then I will quickly go out to the public, but I want to keep things moving along. We're still close to being on time and a lot to get through. So with that, next up we have a report, and Tracy, thank you very much. Really appreciated the work the technical committee did and the excellent presentation there. Thanks for that. Okay, so next we are going to turn to the Jonah Crab Technical Committee report. And for that, I'll look to Corinne Truesdale to walk us through that. So Corinne, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, how's that? Okay, great. All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to walk through, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, a presentation just providing a little bit of stock assessment background that'll contextualize the tasks that the technical committee was given by the board in October. And then included in this review, I'll go over some feedback that we got from the advisory panel to assist us in this task. So the first benchmark assessment for Jonah crab was accepted by the board in October of 2023. As part of that assessment, it established 4 stocks for Jonah crab. We have offshore and inshore Gulf of Maine and offshore and inshore Southern New England. The offshore Southern New England stock is the one where over 75% of the landings on average come from every year. So that's the stock where Jonah crab are targeted, and the others are largely bycatch fisheries. From reviewing the indicators available to the stock assessment subcommittee, they found that the abundance for Jonah crab is above historical lows from the 80s and 90s for the Gulf of Maine and offshore Southern New England, but status was unknown for inshore Southern New England due to data limitations in that area in particular. We don't have absolute estimates of abundance or biomass, and fishing mortality rates are unknown for the stock. So stock status does remain uncertain for all of the stocks for Jonah crab. The peer review panel for the stock assessment had concerns over this decline in landings seen for offshore and Southern New England in the more recent 3 years of the time series. So you can see that there's a time series high in landings in 2018. And after that, a 51% decline in offshore Southern New England landings. The concern for the peer review panel was that this mirrors, or it does resemble, a decline that occurred in the offshore the offshore lobster fishing area 41 fishery in Canada. And so there they had a fishery that was established in 1995 with pretty stable landings, and then experienced a rapid decline starting in 2000 and leading to an almost complete diminishment of landings in 2008, 2009. So given that comparison and the biological data that we have available, or the data limitations that exist for Jonah crab, the technical committee was tasked with these 5 tasks. So the first was to gather current information on management and stock conditions for the Canadian stock. So specific to what's occurred since 2009, when the last assessment was conducted for that fishery. What is being done with regard to management and what monitoring is occurring, and getting some context on fishery characteristics there. Second was to recommend additional indicators from existing data to monitor stocks for Jonah crab. So any additional indicators that we can use to monitor the fishery and the resource itself, in addition to those recommended by the stock assessment subcommittee. Third was to recommend frequency of those indicator updates. Fourth, recommend potential management measures for the Jonah crab fishery in response to any changes in biomass that might be indicated with those indicators. And then fifth, to provide recommendations to improve monitoring in the short term for Jonah crab. So to that end, the TC had meetings on November 16th and January 2nd, and then also requested additional feedback from the advisory panel. They met on December 14th to provide some context related to the fishery characteristics and some input on indicators that could be used for Jonah crab. So I'll launch right into a review of the tasks that we had, starting with the review of the Canadian fishery. So as I mentioned, the last assessment for that LFA 41 offshore fishery occurred in 2009. There has been no ongoing monitoring or assessment in that fishery, and they haven't had any substantial targeting of Jonah crab in that area. When they did have that fishery occurring, so from 1995 to 2009, it was with one sole license holder that owned several boats. So it was one enterprise that had a monopoly on the fishery at that time. Fishery's been largely inactive since 2009, and the management measures have been largely stable with a minimum size at 130 millimeters, 8 millimeters larger than what we have in the United States. And the catch limit, they have had a TAC in place since the beginning of the fishery that was 720 tons. It was reduced after the assessment found that there could be impact, or there was likely impact of the fishery on the resource. They reduced the TAC in 2009, and then they reduced it again in 2017 because it was indicated that there might be interest in retaining Jonah crabs again in the fishery. So largely the management measures have been stable, monitoring has not continued. I'm going to try to breeze through the indicators that we've had and reviewed as part of this task. First, we have catch per unit effort or fishery dependent indicators, starting with the Rhode Island fishery. This was an indicator that was introduced during the peer review process with request by the peer review panel. So we have a subset of high liners or vessels that we know are landing and targeting Jonah crab in Rhode Island, looking at landings per trip over time. And what was concerning here was that there was a decrease, you can see at the end of the time series, in landings per trip among these 5 highliner vessels in Rhode Island. We updated the time series to go through 2022. And you can see when you zoom in on the plot that there really is a decrease in landings per trip that occurred in Rhode Island. From talking to industry, and we'll get into it later on in the presentation, there are market factors at play here, and that's come out through the advisory panel meeting and discussions with industry members there. For Massachusetts, we have not CPUE, but we have an effort time series. We're looking at number of trips that are actually landing Jonah crab from the offshore fishery statistical areas. And we can see that there's been a decline since 2014 with time series lows in those most recent 3 years for the Massachusetts fishery. So we have a lower number of trips that are actually occurring and landing Jonah crab in Massachusetts. Rhode Island and Massachusetts comprising over 90% of the fishery in terms of the landings. So the technical committee recommends continuing to update these fishery dependent indicators for Rhode Island and Massachusetts in particular for this offshore southern New England stock in future years to get an idea of whether things are continuing to change in the fishery or conditions remain stable there. We also looked at price indicators, so looking at Jonah crab and lobster price per pound, with Jonah crab in orange and lobster in blue here from 2010 to 2023. You can see the peak for the Jonah crab price per pound was in 2022 with a decrease thereafter, but is generally high compared to the rest of the time series. For lobster, we had a peak in the price in 2021, and that coincides with when we saw this decline in Jonah crab landings per trip and landings overall. So there is some interplay believed to be occurring, and we know that these two fisheries are linked. They occur in a mixed crustacean fishery. So with that, the technical committee recommends including these price data in indicator updates in the future and looking at price data for lobster and Jonah crab. We'll also note that we did look at a Canadian snow crab and Dungeness crab price per pound and found that the relationship between those and Jonah crab wasn't readily apparent, and there needs to be more work to understand the linkages between those species and Jonah crab. Briefly, we looked at sex ratio data for, this would be sea sampling data and also for trawl survey data. I won't get into this plot. It's less complicated than it looks, but we're looking at sex ratios over time per quarter for a bunch of statistical areas. The takeaway being that there weren't any patterns or any intuitive patterns that you could see in the data here. So we don't recommend looking at sex ratios for indicator updates in the future. We also looked at a suite of length-based indicators as part of the stock assessment process, and then added examination of the 5% smallest crabs being landed in port samples to look at whether there are changes driven by the market in the Jonah crabs that are selected to be landed. Data were too sparse to discern trends. We don't have enough years of data available. So at this time, we don't recommend using those in indicator updates in the future. So brief summary of the indicators that we're recommending for updates in the future. We'd like to continue to look at Rhode Island and Massachusetts catch per unit effort and effort data for Jonah crab, and then price data for Jonah crab and lobster in that offshore southern New England stock in particular. We recommend that for the offshore southern New England stock, fishery dependent indicators be updated annually. And then fishery independent, the trawl survey indicators be updated biannually, knowing that there are constraints on how quickly those data can be processed and reported. For the other stocks, so inshore southern New England, and then inshore and offshore Gulf of Maine, we recommend that the indicators for those stocks be updated every 5 years. Those are largely bycatch fisheries. And so we could update more frequently if there are changes in those fisheries indicated in the next few years, but for now recommend that those indicators are updated every 5 years. We also recommend the advisory panel be included in the update process every year to provide some context with regard to the market and fishery dynamics, to be able to interpret the fishery dependent indices in particular, and to include dealer representation as well in that to get some context in terms of market and competition or interplay between different species markets. We recommend that these updates be provided during the annual meeting every year in October, giving us some time to process the data from the previous calendar year and report that. So as I mentioned, the advisory panel met in December, on December 14th, and 4 advisors attended. They were asked to provide some context and assist with this task that the technical committee was given. So as part of this meeting, they were asked to discuss the stock assessment itself and then economic factors that affect the Jonah crab fishery. The topics included indicators from existing data, so examining the indicators that we had, candidate indicators that might be informative of stock or market conditions for Jonah crab, which might be reliable and what should be considered in interpreting them. Any data that could be used to identify a trip target. So in the Jonah crab and lobster fishery, a big obstacle is being able to determine whether or not a vessel was targeting Jonah crab and to what extent, and using that to interpret catch per unit effort with those data. So the advisory panel was asked to weigh in on that in particular. They were also asked to provide information on why landings have been trending down since the late 2010s, despite there being high prices for Jonah crab in the most recent years, and also to weigh in on what drives CPUE for Jonah crab. So overall, the Jonah crab advisory panel indicated that the decline in landings was related to fleet dynamics, so vessels actually leaving the fleet, not targeting Jonah crab to the same extent that they used to, and that they did indicate, some of them indicated that wind energy development influenced catch per unit effort of Jonah crab, with observations of a decrease in catch during acoustic surveys that were being conducted before offshore wind farm construction. It was noted that prices for Jonah crab were driven by Canadian snow crab and by dynamics in the processing availability in the United States. So noting that there is competition between Canadian snow crab and Jonah crab. If there's more Canadian snow crab available, Jonah crab demand goes down. There are now fewer processors in New England than there used to be. And processors have been placing catch limits on boats or trip limits on boats due to a decreased amount of demand for Jonah crab. The advisory panel notably said that CPUE is mostly driven by market factors for Jonah crab. So price and availability of other crab species, as I mentioned, really drives how much Jonah crab can be bought in the United States. And some of that leads to an intentional selectivity to catch larger crabs. The target species, they also noted, might change on multi-day trips. So we knew this, but there is some spectrum in terms of the target species that they have on a given trip, they might be switching back and forth between Jonah crab and lobster, which complicates straightforward interpretation of trip level information in terms of what they were targeting. So that is a quick summary of the advisory panel comments that we got at that December 14th meeting, providing some context for those fishery dependent indicators and why the trends we're seeing might be occurring. Back to the fourth and fifth tasks of the technical committee. The fourth was to recommend potential management measures for Jonah crab in response to conditions for the stock. So the technical committee considered several management measures, including seasonal closures, effort controls, which would be trap limits, circular vent size changes, and legal minimum size changes. We concluded that identifying the cause of a population change would be necessary to selecting any of those management measures for Jonah crab. For example, sperm limitation might be one mechanism by which there would be a decline in Jonah crab. If you're over harvesting males, there's less reproductive capacity in the stock. And we would recommend seasonal closures or effort controls be examined for their potential to improve stock conditions. Another mechanism might be increased mortality due to environmental conditions, in which case it might be recommended to increase minimum size or modify circular vents to release handling stress or to reduce handling stress on female crabs and provide a reproductive buffer in case environmental conditions were to improve in the future. At this time, we note the technical committee does not believe management action is necessary. This is because of data limitations and the biological condition of the stocks being uncertain at this time. So we are not sure about the absolute abundance of Jonah crab and the impact of the fishery, and further would not be able to evaluate the effectiveness of management measure changes in the near future. This is also complemented by the fact that the demand is going down for Jonah crab. We've had reports that the price has continued to decrease and there's reduced effort in the fishery and a decrease in demand that's continuing. So we don't expect that the fishery landings will be increasing rapidly anytime soon. And we recommend continued monitoring. So that would be observed if it were to occur. For monitoring recommendations moving forward, the technical committee emphasized the high priority research items that were in the stock assessment itself. So those included growth information for that offshore New England stock in particular, examining or exploration of video surveys, which might be a way forward to estimate abundance and fishery impact on the stock, research of recruitment dynamics, including settlement dynamics, research of ecosystem and environmental drivers of population dynamics, including recruitment for Jonah crab. And then finally, research into the interpretation of fishery-dependent data to be able to interpret CPUE and effort data for Jonah crab. This includes interactions between fishery response to abundance for Jonah crab and for lobster, economic drivers, and then of course lobster fishery dynamics along with Jonah crab fishery dynamics. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or provide more information on our indicators.
All right, Corinne, nice job. Thank you for that. Okay, so why don't we start off with questions for Corinne, just maybe another quick summary. So we offered a number of tasks to the technical committee. They went through those tasks. They've indicated some indicators that they think would be good to supplement what we were already looking at, some that weren't that great. They've offered a couple of timelines, didn't recommend the need for management at this time. So some really good feedback from the technical committee. Also some good integration of the advisory panel feedback into that as well. So hopefully I've yammered enough to give you some time to think about any questions. I'm looking around the table for hands for questions for Corinne. No hands at the table. Any virtual hands? No virtual hands either. Okay, so no questions, and that leaves us with, you know, we have a number of recommendations from the technical committee. We could accept those, we could adjust them, or we could not do anything at this time. So what is the will of the board? David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the recommendations. Excellent report, Corinne. With the exception that when you get to the management recommendations, and I'll be diplomatic and say there's a lot of paranoia in the industry about management recommendations. And what I would hope is if the technical people are going to do exploratory research on different types of management recommendations, that they just keep it low key. It's not a board action that's generating it. I mean, we could waste a lot of time, I think, dealing with it. There's no need, in my view, to get into management recommendations. I think this is primarily a marketing problem. And I thought the recommendations that the advisors gave us were well placed. And pointed out one of the things that I particularly noted was this issue of self-selectivity, which has been going on. I personally know of boats that land 20 or 30,000 pounds of Jonah crabs on a trip, and now they're on a quota, and the dealers are basically telling them to land 2,500 pounds or 3,000 pounds. So they pick out the best and most beautiful crabs. All the rest go over the side alive. That has totally changed the behavior. And then there are also relationships between the lobster fishery and the crab fishery that are kind of playing out. Scallopers aren't fishing in a particular area on George's Bank. And as a result of that, what's happening is there's more effort being placed in those areas for targeting lobsters, and there's less effort being placed on crabs. So I think I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on the management. I think the committee has a really good list of items that they can improve without getting into the management issue. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And that aligns with the recommendations of the technical committee as well. So that's great. So we had a comment supporting the recommendations of the technical committee. Anyone else wish to offer? And just having that on the record is fine. We don't need a motion or anything for that. Anyone else on Jonah crabs? No hands in the room. Any hands online? No hands online. Great. I think I will take a quick check here with the public. And so we'd be looking for any comments anyone in the public would like to make on either of the technical committee reports we just heard. I ask you to please keep your comments as concise as possible. We still have a ways to go on our agenda here. So any public in the room wishing to comment or ask a question? No hands in the room. Any hands online? All right. No hands online either. So with that, Tracy and Corinne, thank you both very much. Great job with those reports. Really informative, and hopefully we've provided some good guidance back to the technical committees. Thank you both. All right, moving on our agenda. The next item is to discuss implications of 2025 size limit changes on imports. And for that, I'm going to turn to you, Caitlin, for that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for the background on this topic, Addendum 27, which was approved originally in May 2023, established a trigger mechanism that would automatically implement a series of gauge and vent size changes when the trigger is reached. And the trigger is defined as a 35% decline in the recruit abundance indices of 35% decline in those abundance indices from the reference level, which is equal to the 3-year average from 2016 to 2018. And with the inclusion of the 2022 data in the time series last fall, the trigger index had declined by 39%, surpassing that trigger point of 35% decline. So under addendum 27, this would mean the changes to the gauge and escape vent sizes in the lobster conservation and management areas, LCMAs 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod would be initiated starting in 2024. However, because that trigger was tripped more quickly than anticipated, the board decided to delay the implementation of the measures until January 1st, 2025. Next slide. So this is a reminder of the implementation timeline for those measures since that trigger was reached. So the first change is the LCMA 1 minimum size increased to 3 5/16 of an inch for January 1st, 2025. And that would be followed by another increase to the Area 1 minimum size, then its vent size, and finally a decrease to the maximum size for Outer Cape Cod and Area 3. So when the commission implements management measures for state waters, it also makes recommendations to NOAA fisheries to implement complementary measures in federal waters. And the issue we're specifically looking at today is the size limit of lobster imports. The Magnuson-Stevens Act includes some language, which is called the Mitchell provision, which prohibits the import and sale of lobsters smaller than the minimum possession size in effect under the commission's FMP. And this provision was intended to prevent smaller lobster than what the US industry can catch from coming into the US market. So staff has been hearing that there are two potential interpretations of this provision and how it would impact the live market size limits. And we're looking for some clear guidance on this so that we don't end up with different regulations for different jurisdictions or patchwork. So those two interpretations that we understand to be possible are first, that when the lobster measures go into effect because of addendum 27, then the imports from other countries would be restricted to the smallest LCMA minimum size, which will be 3 5/16 of an inch starting January 1st, 2025. And this would be interpreting that the Mitchell provision's intent is that the minimum size of live lobster coming into the US could not be any smaller than the smallest effective size limit of any of the LCMAs. The second interpretation would mean that imports from other countries would be restricted to the coastwide minimum size in the commission's FMP, which is 3 1/4 inches. And in this case, the coastwide minimum size is the size limit that no conservation management area may go below, but it's not an active size limit for any of the LCMAs. After January 1st, 2025, no LCMA will have an active minimum size that matches that coastwide minimum. Next slide. So previously we got feedback from the Law Enforcement Committee about this issue that generally if imports were allowed to be smaller than the minimum gauge size in effect in the US, it could create additional challenges for enforcement. In particular, it would open up opportunities for the illegal sale of US caught lobster that are below the legal minimum size. The LEC said enforcing the size difference when lobsters are coming into the US from Canada at the border wouldn't be as much of an issue, but that once lobsters go to a dealer in the US from another foreign country, they're usually commingled for sale with the US caught lobster. And so it would be hard to maintain separation of those lobster of different origins. In some states that do currently have a larger minimum size than what is in place in Maine, they have dealt with the trade issue by requiring their dealers to have special exemption permits in order to possess lobsters from Maine or Canada that are under their state's minimum legal size. And they have requirements for those dealers to report on shipments of smaller lobster and keep records of all of their transactions. And they're not allowed to sell those lobsters within the state. So that could be something to consider if imports were allowed to be smaller than the LMA 1 minimum size. So for the board's discussion today, staff is looking for clarification as to the board's intent for the size limit that would apply to foreign imports of lobster after January 1st, 2025. I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Caitlin. Tony, go ahead.
And Jason, depending on the board's intent, we may need to initiate an addendum, not in the typical addendum fashion where it would be management options, but more to clarify to the public of what our intent is in terms of recommending to NOAA Fisheries what will happen, but it'll depend on how the board gives us feedback.
Great, thank you, Tony. So we'll kind of keep our eye on that as the discussion happens here. So let's go out first for questions for Caitlin from the board. Anyone online with questions? Okay. So Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. 35 years ago was the last time the Area 1 gauge was raised, and the Mitchell bill, or the Mitchell provision in the Magnuson Act, was enacted specifically to address the challenges of having live commingled lobsters from within a jurisdiction of one of the lobstering jurisdictions and from outside, and the potential to undermine the enforcement and compliance. So it really makes no sense to me to assume that a 3 1/4 inch minimum size would be acceptable around the country if the Mitchell bill was very clear saying, no, the minimum size should be the smallest minimum size allowed or in place among all of the lobstering jurisdictions in the United States. So I would be in favor of the commission initiating a very brief addendum, because from my understanding of the dilemma that we're in, it had to do with conversations on the record that even though the motion to pass this addendum may not have sent a clear signal about the applicability of the Mitchell provision, I think conversations on the record and conversations by staff that I failed to maybe hear. But I think that and I just came from Moncton, New Brunswick at the International Lobster Town meeting last week, and kind of give folks a heads up that I expected the commission to deliberate on this issue today and take an action to clarify this. So I don't know if you need a motion to initiate an addendum to clarify that addendum 27 shall include compliance with the Mitchell provision, or that we want to signal to the National Marine Fisheries Service that the Mitchell provision should apply as written.
Okay, thank you, Dan. It looks like, so let me come back to you, Dan, on the need for a direct motion, but certainly a recommendation to initiate an addendum as suggested by Tony as we started out here. So thanks for that. I'll look around the table to see if anybody has any support or anything different than what Dan has suggested here. Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is certainly a difficult issue, and it's one that's taken a lot of time to work through back home in Maine. I think some clarity on where we're going here is needed. The Lobster Advisory Council for DMR did take this issue up. They have actually formed a working group. I think that working group certainly from a harvester perspective has been very specific about live lobster trade and not wanting to see that live product coming into the U.S. to compete with ours. We call it the Colorado example, right? If the federal government does something different than the primary states do going forward, you could have potentially a lobster business showing up in another state, right? Disadvantaging the primary states, right? If there is not some clarity. So I appreciate the intent of what Dan is thinking about. It's a complicated issue, and would support this going out for a broader public conversation in the future here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Doug, I saw your hand.
I was just going to second Dan's motion.
Okay, Okay, I think we do, want a motion here, and I think they're working on something based on what you said, so bear with us. Yeah, so we have a motion up on the board. I think we want to make sure there's been a little addition here, Dan, so just make sure that this is okay. Yeah, go ahead, Dan, thank you.
Yeah, that looks good, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And just to clarify that, consistent with NIMS's interpretation of this, processed lobsters are not subject to this Mitchell bill. So a cooked lobster can, enter the U.S. markets. Something that's processed. It's really about the enforceability of the minimum size. I want that on the record. That even I'll stop there.
How does this look?
Looks fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion here made by Dan McKiernan. Have the second. I would love it if you would read that, Dan. Thank you.
I'd be happy to. Motion to initiate an addendum to clarify that addendum 27 shall include compliance with the Mitchell provision and signal to National Marine Fisheries Service that the smallest implemented minimum size should apply to imports.
Okay, so I had the motion made by Dan McKiernan, seconded by Doug Grout. Any further discussion on the motion from the board? No hands around the table. Any hands online? Okay, so no further discussion. Looks like we have some public that'd like to comment, so I will entertain that. I see one hand in the back. Sir, you can come up. There should be a public microphone over there.
Thank you. Dustin Delano. I'm a commercial harvester for lobster from Maine, and I also represent the New England Fishermen Stewardship Association. We also would agree with this motion. There would be a major inequity here if we allowed the federal minimum to continue at 3 1/4 after the gauge is changed, and the enforcement issues would also be quite problematic. So while many in the industry may not have agreed on the gauge increase itself, most of us wholeheartedly agree that the Mitchell bill needs to be made a part of Addendum 27. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the comment. So the board can consider that. Okay, I'm going to go to Pat first, and then I've got a hand online as well.
This may be for Tony. We continue to talk about the minimum size component here as it relates to the Mitchell provision within Magnuson. In the near future, we will have a maximum size on the outer cape. How do we deal with the provision of oversize going forward? Right? I mean, that is another type of inequity, right? Where oversized product is currently allowed to come in because we had no maximum size associated with a portion of the outer Cape cod fishery. Now that that's closing, how do we want to handle that?
Mr. Chairman, if Beth could give her comment, and then I will consider Pat's question and then come back to the board. But if Beth Cassoni could provide comment, she has her hand raised, so I can think while she comments.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony. Yeah.
I want a moment to think about it, so if you can let Beth go first before I reply to Pat.
I got you now. Yeah, thank you. So Pat, we will come back to your question. Beth Cassoni, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Beth Cassoni, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association. Sorry, could you hear me? I just realized my mic wasn't on. I really appreciate Dan's motion, and we would support this wholeheartedly. Massachusetts is limited in the number of months that they can fish, and to have the Canadian lobsters come into the market when our fishermen are just getting back would even cause further economic harm. So we would support this wholeheartedly. And I'd like to thank Mr. Kelleher for his comment on the oversize, because that's yet another inequity. And we look forward to seeing this come out to the public for more input. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth. Tony, kind of looking towards you. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that moment to think. The Mitchell provision language is very specific to minimum sizes only. So I think we'd have to consider what we could do for maximum sizes. I think we'll have to confer with our NOAA counterparts to see if there's anything that we could do within the realm of our FMP and NOAA's FMP, but I'm not sure I don't want to say I don't have anything off the top of my head right now. Chip Lynch, the attorney for NOAA Fisheries, is in the audience right now. If he has any ideas that would work immediately off the top of your head, Chip, you could come to the microphone, but if you don't have anything, it's okay. You don't have to come to the microphone.
Chip, you're welcome to if you don't mind being put on the spot.
It's what I do, I guess. So I'm going to expand your question and say that as a lawyer, I'm looking for some clarification on this particular motion. The Mitchell provision is law, so we don't need a recommendation to comply with the law. The question, excuse me, you're free to recommend that, by the way. I'm just saying that we're going to follow the law, period. The question is, the Mitchell Act says that there is a prohibition on imports to the minimum, below the minimum possession size in the plan. Historically, the lowest in the plan has always been the same as the lowest in the whatever LCMA, which would include Area 1. I think potentially, if the facts supported it, if the enforcement facts supported it, that could always be decoupled. You could have 3 1/4 be the lowest size in the plan, and 3 5/16 be the lowest size in the LCMA. Again, you'd have to nuance it, figure it depends on the facts, how you want to word it. But that's, I guess, the potential. So as a lawyer, I'm looking at this, and the real question I had for Addendum 27 was, what was the intent of the board? Was the intent of the board to restrict imports below the new lowest, most restrictive 3 5/16, or was it to sort of bifurcate the two and allow imports to be continue as is, keeping 3 1/4 as the lowest size in the plan, but increasing in Area 1? And I think, Dan, that is what is intended by this addendum to clear up. But I just wanted to just this is what lawyers get paid to do, is to parse language. And I know it's annoying, but I just so you're aware of that. Now, the real reason you asked me to come up to the microphone was you were asking about a maximum size. Incidentally, the federal government does not have a separate fishery management plan. The fishery management plan that we operate off of is the ISFMP that the commission has. So if the commission chose to do something in a plan and it was rationally related to the facts and to the best available science and all, and that could include restrictions potentially and hypothetically on a max, if the commission went down that path, then made a recommendation to NOAA Fisheries, we would consider that recommendation, again, based upon the law and the facts as it existed at the time. It's hard for me to answer very specifically because it's just because it is so hypothetical at this point. Is
Thank you,
that
Chip.
helpful?
Appreciate that. So Tony, did you still want me to come to you? Okay, so Dan had his hand up, so go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so to respond to Chip, that is my intent of the motion. And just for purposes of conversation, I'm looking at the slide here of all the maximum sizes. And we have 3 different maximum sizes among all the management plans. So I guess the least restrictive rule would be a 6 3/4 inch maximum size, of course, coming down by virtue of addendum 27 to 6.5. So ultimately, it'll be a 6.5 inch maximum size. I don't think it's quite the enforcement burden that a minimum size is, because those big lobsters aren't all that common, but it would be helpful if we could find a way to have a similar Mitchell provision on the maximum size as well, but I think that's for another day. This particular motion is trying to zero in on that which would be consistent with the law as enacted in 1989.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Pat, just kind of looking back to you, anything further you want to do on this for now, I guess?
Honestly, I'm a little bit, I hadn't really thought about bringing this up associated with this, but as we started talking about this, looking at some of my comments that have been made to me, thinking about some of the comments that have been made to me over the last several months, this oversize issue continues to come up. It usually comes up associated with the gray zone. The gray zone issue for us is very specific, and this, even though on the minimum size, doesn't take care of it, right? If the lobster fisherman in the gray zone catches a lobster and throws it over, right now, a Canadian harvester right beside him could still keep that. The same is true on the oversized, right? So those larger lobsters that they're throwing back over the maximum are being kept. So the inequity of the issue is highlighted really clearly in those 2 cases in the gray zone. But from an enforcement side, to Dan's point, and the reason I started thinking about this again, is we started to really go through the process of what happens from an enforcement standpoint if that small live lobster is allowed into the US, and what we would have to do to segregate, to deal with the chain of custody, to be able to enforce that issue. Well, we do that now for oversize, and it's a lot less product, and it's an incredible burden to patrol and to the dealers that are dealing with it, right? So I'm just wondering if this document shouldn't, at very least, just have an option to consider it. We take comment on it and then make a determination at the time of making a final decision whether to do something or not.
Thanks, Pat. So I think the idea here is to potentially add this into the current, at least the current idea of an addendum, not talking about the parliamentary way to get there yet. We think we have a plan here, so I'm going to go to you, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to amend to add the consideration of a maximum size limit for imports.
Thank you, Pat. Is there a second? Dan McKiernan seconds the motion to amend. So we got a motion up on the board and it's been seconded. Pat, does this look okay, the language?
Yeah, I think that's fine, Mr. Chairman. I think this gives us the ability, the time to have some additional conversations with NOAA in regards to this issue, make sure that we've, from a legality standpoint, right, that we're not straying here, but it also adds that consistency to address the inequity component within the addendum going forward. And at least we could take comments on it and make a determination later whether we need to do something or not. So, thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Dan, did you want to add anything?
No, sir.
Okay. So now we have a motion to amend up on the board. Any discussion on this amended motion? Seeing no hands around the table, any hands online? No hands online. Okay. Do people need, why don't we take a minute here to caucus before we call the question? I don't know, maybe 2 minutes. Sorry, 1 minute to caucus, just in case people need to text or whatever with folks who aren't here. So 1 minute, it's actually already running, so we'll be back in 48 seconds. Okay, as the last seconds are ticking off the clock here, it looks like most folks here in the room are ready to go. So I will look around the table and ask if there are any objections to the amended motion. Seeing none in the room, any hands online? Okay, so there are no objections to the amended motion here. Oh, sorry. So the amendment passes by consent, unanimous consent. So now we're going to go to what is now the main motion here. Read it. Okay, so the motion is now, the motion is to initiate an addendum to clarify that addendum 27 shall include compliance with the Mitchell provision. Signal to the National Marine Fisheries Service at the smallest implemented minimum size shall apply to imports, and to also consider a maximum size limit for imports. Okay, so we have now a main motion. I will look around the room. Can anyone let me know if they need a minute to caucus? Not seeing any. Okay, so I will ask the question again. Are there any objections to this motion? Please raise your hand if you're in the room. Anyone online with objections? No hands online. So this motion also passes by unanimous consent. Okay, I think we got it. Thanks, everybody. All right, so let's keep moving along here, and I think I'm up next. So the next item here is to consider pursuing a management strategy evaluation. I'm going to go super fast, and I'll just give a high sign to flip the slide. So we've talked about this a couple of times. Now we've been sort of dragging this along with us through the process here. I've got a quick presentation to just kind of consider whether we want to implement a management strategy evaluation for Lobster. Pat, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I meant to catch your eye before this. Understanding our time constraints here, but also understanding the fact that we have a benchmark stock assessment coming up. I'm just wondering if we shouldn't bring this back up as soon as we have the finalized stock assessment for consideration. Just from a timing aspect, doing both of those things at the same time seems highly problematic to me. I meant to catch your eye before you started down this road, but just wanted to bring that to your attention to see if we wanted to delay this for a bit.
So there is, I have an opinion on that, but I'm going to keep it to myself as chair. And I'll look around the table to see if anyone else agrees with Pat, which would basically just skip over this agenda item for today. Dan?
I agree with Pat.
Mike, did you want to make a comment? Just giving a thumbs up. Okay. Okay. I guess that does that. If that's the will of the board, anyone with a different opinion, and I guess I don't get to have that different opinion. Not seeing any. Okay, off we go then. So next on the agenda is to discuss inconsistencies in federal and commission rules for lobster conservation management areas 2 and 3. And I believe I go to you first, Caitlin.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to just provide some background on these two addenda 21 and 22, which are the basis for the recent NOAA rulemaking for area 2 and 3 trap and ownership caps. So addendum 21 and 22 were part of a series of addenda that the board initiated after the 2009 stock assessment, which found that the southern New England lobster stock was depleted. So in response to that, the board initiated these addenda to scale back the size of the SNE fishery to match the size of the lobster resource. Before these two addenda 18 and 19 had already initiated trap allocation reductions in Area 2 and Area 3, and the conservation transfer tax in Area 3. So in that context, addendum 21 and 22 were meant to address trap transferability and trap caps in Area 2 and 3. Addendum 21 changed the transferability program for LCMA 2 and 3, and Addendum 22 changes the single and aggregate ownership limits in Area 3. These changes were designed to allow for some flexibility in the movement of traps as the consolidation program for LMA 2 and 3 to address latent effort was implemented, and they were intended to provide a mechanism for the industry to maintain a profitable fishery during the period of trap reductions. So specific to LCMA2, Addendum 21 modified the transferability program such that when there was a transfer of a trap allocation with a history for multiple areas, the recipient of that transfer would be able to maintain that multi-LCMA history. And at the start of each fishing year, they would have to declare which area or areas were to be fished. It also established a single ownership trap cap for LCMA2 of a maximum of 1,600 traps, 800 of which could be active and 800 banked. However, 2 years after the final year of trap reductions on LCMA2, which was in 2022, the cap would return to an 800 maximum traps per entity. And then lastly, Addendum 21 established an aggregate ownership cap for LMA2 of 2 permits and 1,600 traps. And there were a group of permit holders that had more than 2 permits as of December 2003, and they were allowed to maintain those additional permits and traps. Next slide. For LMA3, Addendum 21 made the same change to the transferability program about the multi-LCMA trap allocation transfers. And it also established active trap cap reductions for Area 3 that were recommended for implementation by NOAA, starting with a cap of 2,000 traps that would then be reduced by 5% per year for 5 years, in conjunction with the LMA3 trap allocation reductions from Addendum 18. Addendum 22 focused only on Area 3, and it established single and aggregate ownership caps. The single ownership cap for Area 3 would allow for an entity to accumulate more traps than the active trap cap, and this assumed the 2,000 active trap cap from Addendum 21 would be implemented by NOAA, and that would decrease by 5% per year. So this table shows the expected single ownership caps that would be implemented each year. Then the aggregate ownership cap for Area 3 that was recommended in Addendum 22 limited a single entity's traps to 5 times the single ownership trap. So this was based on the maximum number of permits being 5 permits per entity. So in this table, each year, the aggregate ownership cap would be 5 times the number that was in the previous table. And entities that had already accumulated more traps than the aggregate cap before the control date published by NOAA were exempt and allowed to maintain those excess traps. So for a summary of all of the measures in Addendum 22 for LMA3, this table shows the active trap caps, individual permit caps, and aggregate permit caps for the first year and each year following the implementation of the measures by NOAA. And I'm going to pause here and pass the presentation to Allie Murphy, and then I'll come back for a few more slides.
Allie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So we certainly recognize that over 10 years have passed since these recommendations were made by the Lobster Board, and things could have changed in that time frame. Following the publication of the proposed rule in the summer of 2022, we got some comments, including from the Commission, requesting additional time to consider these measures and understand them in the current context of the fishery. So we published an interim final rule this past October, implementing the measures in 2025 as a backstop, but also taking additional comment on these measures to be responsive to that request. While that comment period has closed, I think this is still a valuable discussion for the board to have. These measures stem from your recommendations, and if they no longer make sense in the current context of the fishery, then the board could alter their recommendations. Next slide, please. I made a few terminology changes in the rule based on some public comments. I removed permit from the caps because traps were really the currency that we saw, and having permit in the title of these things caused confusion. The word active also caused a lot of confusion in the comments we received, and folks were wondering if we were trying to regulate actively fished traps differently than traps that are not actively fished, and so we clarified that to the maximum trap cap. So I just wanted to highlight that for everyone here as I walk through the next few slides. Next slide, please. Just a quick note on banking. I think there was some confusion that came up during the public input session a week or so ago. As I understood it, the commission would have allowed banking by stacking additional or inactive traps on a single permit above the area's maximum trap cap, which could be actively fished. That's what we are not allowing, or that's what we did not propose and ultimately did not implement in this action. If an owner had a second vessel that they are essentially using, or a second vessel with a second permit that they are essentially using as a bank, that this action would not affect that vessel, permit, and traps. Next slide, please. So for the Area 2 measures, we implemented an ownership cap of 800 traps per person. We also allowed those who were over that cap as of May 1st, 2022 to retain those traps, but would prevent them from acquiring additional traps in the future. And we will implement this cap on May 1st, 2025, unless recommendations change and we take additional action. The big difference, as I said, is we didn't implement the banking provisions that the commission had considered and recommended. With the trap reductions having been completed, we saw those as no longer necessary. Next slide, please. I just wanted to give a quick example here of how we're looking at the ownership caps. Forgive my use of the Beatles, but kind of the best example I could come up with here. And please assume that everybody is alive. I know there are some deceased people, some deceased names on this. But these are a few situations that were discussed during the input session that I felt might highlight how we're looking at ownership and taking ownership back to the people behind all of the vessels and permits and, excuse me, potentially corporations. So we have the three McCartneys. They're all part of a single corporation. They own 3 vessels. Those vessels each have Area 2 allocation that total 1,550 traps. So each of those people would be capped at 1,550 traps going forward. The next example, we have George Harrison, who has 1 vessel in ownership under his name. The other vessel is in corporate ownership. Those 2 vessels combined for 1,800 traps. He is capped at 1,080 traps. He is capped at that level going forward. Finally, we have Ringo, who owns a single vessel under his name with 625 traps. He would be allowed to build up to 800 traps under this rule as it currently stands. So my main objective here was just showing how we are taking trap allocations associated with the people behind the permits, behind the vessels and the permits, and implementing the caps on the people. I hope that's helpful. Next slide, please. In our environmental assessment, we assessed this as having fairly minimal impacts because it caps the fishery as it currently exists. It's not going to take traps away from anybody, but yes, it certainly would prevent folks building up their businesses in the future above these caps. Since that analysis, we looked at some ownership data, and we know there are 24 people who are capped at allocations above 800. And there are some overlapping ownership interests there, like husbands and wives and siblings, like the examples I showed previously. We also know since that time, one person, or since May 1st, 2022, one person completed trap transfers. And that person stands to lose those traps because they were made after that May 1st, 2022 line in the sand. Next slide, please. Jumping into the Area 3 measures, we implemented or will implement a reduction in the maximum trap cap from 1,945 traps to 1,548 traps. We're doing that over 3 years, and that's the big difference here. The commission had recommended that over 5 years. So we'll be jumping to year 2, year 4, and then year 5 of the commission's recommendations. These are assessed, this will be assessed against each permit. So as you'll see in the next slide, some folks stand to lose some traps. And again, this will be implemented if nothing changes in 2025. Next slide, please. So as I said moments ago, there are some impacts associated with this. We know in the first year, or based on 2019 data, there were 21 vessels who had allocations over 1,805 traps. And so those folks would stand to lose those traps. That totals a little over 1,000 traps. By year 3, we have 43 vessels who stand to lose some traps, and that totals just around or just under 10,000 traps. Certainly folks could take advantage of the trap transfer program to either move allocations between their vessels if they own multiple, or sell them to try to recoup some of the costs. So the specific impacts are a little bit unclear, as we don't really can't predict exactly what business decisions will be made. And just in looking at more recent data, that looks pretty similar to this, so wasn't worth noting changes here. Next slide, please. With regard to the Area 3 ownership cap, we are implementing a cap that's 5 times the maximum trap cap in a given year. So the final aggregate ownership cap would be 7,740 traps per person. Again, this is assessed to each person, same as the example with Area 2. Those who are over the cap as of May 1st, 2022, again, would be allowed to retain those traps but not build up. And the big difference here is, again, eliminating that banking provision there. In Caitlin's slide, there was an intermediate step between the trap cap and the aggregate ownership cap that we did not propose or implement. Next slide. So again, with the ownership caps, because this caps the fishery as it currently exists, we didn't assess any serious impacts here. 2 folks are over the cap of 7,740 traps. So those folks would be capped at their current levels and wouldn't be allowed to build up anymore. Nobody made business decisions after May 1st, 2022 that changes anything. So next slide. I think this is my last slide. I have links to the interim final rule, and then all of the comments we've received on this. And I'm happy to answer any questions on the rule or anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Back to Caitlin.
Thank you. So as most of you know, we had a public meeting on January 10th to get some input on the NOAA rules and how they would impact the fishery in its current context, since these rules were intended to be implemented about 10 years ago, and there have been lots of changes in the fishery since then. So we had about 58 people in attendance at this meeting, including LCMA 2 and 3 stakeholders, as well as commissioners, state and ASMFC staff. Next slide. So at this meeting, the input received from Area 2 stakeholders included that they want to see a change to the sunset date of May 1st, 2022. That's in the NOAA rule to a future date. And they suggested different dates between now and 2030. And the argument there is that the date needs to be proactive because they can't plan to respond to this if it's in the past. So we also heard that they do not support the maximum ownership cap of 800 traps. Instead, they would like to maintain the 2 permits with 800 traps each, because this gives them more flexibility and allows families to keep their traps within the family if someone were to leave the fishery. They also commented that the fishery is a lot different today than 10 years ago. They noted increases in cost, new marine mammal and whale regulations, wind power development, and the development of the Jonah crab fishery. Next slide. Regarding the Area 3 measures, the majority of the stakeholders that spoke on this in the meeting said they did not support the trap cap reductions and ownership caps. Their reasoning behind this is that they said the ownership caps were really meant to prevent consolidation in the fishery, but they noted that consolidation has already occurred, and now that the offshore fishery has a different makeup, these measures would disadvantage the larger fleets that are now there. They also commented that they don't think the measures would really reduce traps, but just spread them out across more vessels and permits. And another reason they no longer support these caps is that they believe there will not be a biological benefit from it. And they referenced the impact analysis in the NOAA rule. And then, as I mentioned, the fishery has changed in the last 10 years or so, and they specifically commented that it's no longer majority owner operator as it was. And so the fleet does not support measures that are intended to keep it owner operator. Additionally, they also mentioned that increased business costs, marine mammal protections, wind farms, and the increase in the Jonah crab fishery were not part of the equation when these rules were developed. Next slide. There was one former Area 3 fisherman during the meeting that disagreed with those sentiments. They instead thought that the trap caps would increase the efficiency of the fleet by lowering bait and gas costs, and that these rules would reduce the fishing pressure on the lobster stock. They commented that in southern New England, the accessible bottom area is decreasing due to wind farms, closed areas, and other reasons, but the number of traps is not, and that's problematic. And it was noted that the trap reductions in the NOAA rule were counted towards the large whale risk reductions. And finally, they noted that they think more closed areas will likely open to mobile gear, and more lobster gear will be displaced in the future. And that's the summary of input from the public meeting, and I can take any questions, and Allie can take questions.
Great. Thanks, Allie and Caitlin, very much. So you got a good slug of background there, and then you got some information about the feedback that we got when we went out to the industry. Before we kind of get into the discussion here, first, any questions that anyone has for Caitlin or Allie? Okay, not seeing any questions. We can get right into the discussion. Dan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank NOAA for delaying the final rule while we provide this input at the 11th hour. Actually, I think it's 10 past midnight. So, but I am grateful that they're considering this input. I also want to thank ASMFC staff for putting that great webinar together and giving the industry and also us managers to kind of get refreshed and to hear firsthand what their concerns were 2 weeks ago. And of course, the public for their participation. The goals of this addenda were good goals, but they were goals that were established 11 years ago. And since then, so much has transpired. So many permits have been transferred. And many businesses have really altered their arrangements. It's mentioned in one of the slides that it's no longer a predominantly owner-operated small boat, my single boat fishery. We're seeing the proliferation of these fleets, which was one of the goals to avoid, but it's too late. And that's one of the reasons that I think we should be pumping the brakes. Many trap allocations have been transferred as a means to mitigate against those trap cuts, including traps that might have to be lost as a result of these final actions should NOAA take those. If we enact the rules as outlined in NOAA's proposed rule or in the original language enacted 11 years ago, there could be serious unintended consequences, especially with the activation of traps that currently aren't even being fished. And also we would be torquing some of the scales of the Area 3 fleet, which is probably inappropriate and unnecessary for the reasons that were mentioned on the slide, such as offshore wind development, which is going to displace vessels all around the Gulf of Maine, as well as the Jonah crab situation in marine mammals. I'm going to confess that we've been remiss, me personally and others, of keeping an active set of LCMTs. The current rosters are peppered with the names of permit holders who are no longer in the fishery. My request and my recommendation is to reconstitute those LCMTs, convene them, and then return back to this board with some new goals and new objectives to manage effort in the two LCMAs, Area 2 and Area 3. And I have a motion once you're done taking comments from the rest of the board.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Before we go to Dan for the motion, anybody else want to jump in? Not seeing any. David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan made a lot of the points that I intended to make, but I think we find ourselves in a position where we really need a do-over in spite of all the good intentions. They're over 10 years old, and the factual situation has almost totally changed. Dan spoke quite eloquently about the Area 3 circumstances, but in the case of the Area 2 circumstances, that they used to be a really prominent lobster fishery similar to the Maine coast fishery, where everyone was dedicated to lobstering. They did it 100% of the time. The Rhode Island and Mass fishery, and about 98% of the permits are now contained in those two states. That fishery only exists because it is transitioned into a multi-species fishery that now needs to have different vessel capacities and different crewing and all sorts of different changes. So what started out is kind of a desire to have a continuation of that owner-operator fishery and small boats is transitioning as we speak. And I think we've got to kind of reflect on that and take a step back and reconsider what we put in there, look at the proposed rule. And while I'm on the proposed rule, I'd just like to take the time to comment on the rule itself, and not on the language in the rule, but more the individuals that crafted it. I really thought they did an excellent job of putting together a rule that was almost 12 years late. I mean, they were incredibly creative in terms of how they handled some of the disconnects that were created by the time lapse. So I just want to, I realize that's a little bit of a backhanded compliment, but they really deserve praise because I think they did an excellent job. So I'm happy to second that motion, Mr. Chairman, when you get around to it.
Great, thank you, David. Okay, let's get to it then. Dan, I'll come to you for the motion that is also up on the board here.
Okay, move to recommend to the ISFMP Policy Board that the Commission send a letter to NOAA Fisheries to withdraw the Commission's recommendation to implement the measures of Section 3 and 4 Except section 3.1.1 and 3.2.1, transfers of multi-LCMA trap allocation of addendum 21 and all of addendum 22. I'm not sure that the way that's worded is easy to follow, but essentially we are asking to withdraw all of 21 and all of 22, our endorsement of 21 and 22, except those two sections in 21, which is 3.1.1 and 3.2.1, that has to do with the transfers of multi-LCMAs, trap allocations.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Motion made, seconded by David Borden. Any further discussion, Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to support the motion, but just for the record, I think there needs to be a little bit of due diligence done. If you all recall, a year ago, December, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which gave a 6-year reprieve, or put us in compliance for 6 years with both the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a critical step in helping us have the time we need to deal with the data deficiencies going forward, so we can have some better tools, better data to make some decisions going forward. I talked to Chip Lynch before this meeting, knowing this was coming up. This was not in place when Congress initiated or passed that law. However, I would just encourage us to make sure that the data associated with this was not something that was considered in the risk reductions, just to make sure that we are not inadvertently finding ourselves either slightly out of compliance with the intent of the statute in Congress, but we also have some decisions coming up from Judge Boasberg related to these cases. And so we certainly don't want to signal that we're trying to weaken any efforts. For the record, I don't think this is weakening anything. I just want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence as it pertains to the risk reductions that were done associated with the rules that were implemented in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Shuri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can support this motion. My question would be, we're asking to withdraw the commission's recommendation for these items. I presume that will be moving forward with further recommendations in the near future as opposed to the far future. That would be my only concern. I think that the conservation measures still need to move forward. They just might need to move forward in a different manner. I understand that, but I just don't want to lose that momentum of conservation measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuri. David.
I'm glad both Pat and Shuri have raised this, because I think we need some dialogue on the record relative to what the intent is. And I think Dan said it, but he probably didn't emphasize it enough. At least my intent is to do exactly what Shuri characterized. Looking forward, I think what we have to do is kind of extract ourselves from the proposed rule process, and this will do that. And then at the next meeting, basically get to work on what we're going to take for action. I think Dan and I have discussed this before, and I think what's needed here is, as we go forward, we basically task the LCMTs to go back, review the rules in a broad context where they'd have great flexibility to look at the rules and come up with alternatives that still meet the original objective of what we were trying to get at. And I would add to that, I think they have to factor in some kind of discussion on protected species issues as part of that. And the reason I say that is because I was heavily involved in that aspect of it when I worked for AOLA. And the offshore industry got 12 risk reduction points for their actions with the trap cuts. If they back away from the trap cuts, then they're going to lose that risk reduction. They've already gone on record saying they can't live with weak ropes. They're going to find themselves in an unenviable position of having nothing that's practical. So I think the industry really needs to look at that, look at all the alternatives like consolidation, the way the Canadians did it on fewer boats and cut traps that way, or some other alternative, and come up with alternatives that still meet the original objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Okay, a quick last look around the table for any additional comments on the motion. I'm not seeing any. What I'd like to do is take a few public comments. I ask that any public commenters, if you made public comments at the workshop we had, please don't repeat those. You know, the board has that information already. And if you have something new you'd like to offer, please be very concise. We'd like to keep it to a minute. We're already over time here by 4 minutes. So with that, I'm going to look for some public hands. And the first one we have is Erica Fuller. So Erica, whenever you're ready, feel free to unmute and give us your comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Allison and Caitlin, for the presentations. I want to follow up on the comments that Mr. Kelleher and Mr. Borden made. This is really problematic from a conservation perspective, and while we do understand the rationales, and perhaps these two actions need to be reconsidered. But if the commission does back away from these measures, and this question may be for NOAA General Counsel, does the agency plan to develop or implement some other comparable measures that achieve the same risk reduction? Or does it plan to convene the team to advise on new recommendations? Because in our view, Congress absolutely relied on these trap cap reductions going into place when the commission said it was going to, and we'd like to see something in place sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Any other hands online? Okay, no other hands online. Back to the table, Pat.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, but David's comments made me just leave a little bit more uneasy associated with that, referencing the 12 risk reduction points associated with this. And so it may be better, and I don't think this necessarily changes the intent of with the motion as it's been made, but as we're going forward, it may be better to consider what we're replacing this with, right? From a risk equivalency standpoint, understanding how that's what the interaction is, right? So we certainly don't want to jeopardize what we have in place. So we need to really think critically about how that's going to play out while trying to deal with the time lag and how the fishery has evolved over time. Dan eloquently talked about the challenges that we have in place and how the fisheries change. So Maine's perspective, we don't have a dog in this fight, with the exception of how the Consolidated Appropriations Act played out. So I just want to make sure, again, for the record, that we're taking all of these things into consideration before we're making any final decisions about how this may play out.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, Doug, go ahead.
Just to follow up on Pat's comments, is there some benefit to begin to already have an idea of what's going to be replacing those 12 conservation credits before we withdraw our support for this addendum? Because sitting here and saying, okay, we're going to pull this apart, then we're going to convene the LCMTs, find out what is a better way to do, give us some ideas and a better way to do this, and then initiate another addendum, assuming it can be done with an addendum that also implements it. That's a time, that's going to be a that's going to take a little bit of time. And is that going to be enough time to have something in place to still get those conservation credits? I'm just afraid, be careful what, Area 3 and Area 2 wishes for here. You could end up with something a lot worse if you don't have something in mind and how you're going to replace it.
Thank you, Doug. John Maniscalco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to agree with Doug Grout that I guess the implications of this are not entirely clear. And I think we need to think about that before we kind of take what seems to me to be hasty action. And I do think we have to consider right whale conservation. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So let's see. I got a couple, so I'll go to you first, Andy. Go ahead. Adam, I always do that. Adam, go ahead.
I've been called far worse on the boat, Mr. Chairman, so it's okay. Does the service have any input here they could offer in terms of their process for rulemaking that might give us some more time to figure out what exactly we should be saying and when we need to say it?
Ali, if you want.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me better? Thank you very much for the question. And Chip, if I get this wrong, if you could jump in and correct me. But I think you do have some time here. I think if we were to, let me start over. I don't think we could easily change, just swap out what was included in the interim final rule with the new recommendation. I don't think we could do that easily in a single follow-up rule here. I think a more logical process would be for, if this recommendation were to go through, for us to withdraw those measures and start a new rulemaking to consider whatever the commission or whatever the Lobster Board's new recommendations are. And as we know, NOAA Fisheries is not super fast in getting new regulations in place. So I do think the board has a little bit of time to contemplate what it might want to do next. Chip, do you have anything else to?
Chip, if you'd like, yep, come on up.
So to clarify one point that Ali made, maybe it was clear. There is a present interim final rule. It is based upon the commission process and the commission recommendation that we previously received. If the commission, we would be interested in knowing whether the commission wants to stick with its recommendation or withdraw their recommendation or withdraw part of their recommendation. It would be extraordinarily difficult and potentially not legal to add and amend that recommendation. So that we would be amending this rule in this rule. Now, if the commission wanted to do a follow-on addendum and then make a later recommendation, of course, we would treat that as a regular rulemaking. I would further note, just for the sake of clarity, that this particular rule was about lobster, and it was promulgated under the Atlantic Coastal Fisheries Cooperative Management Act. That's the Atlantic Coastal Act. It has an ancillary benefit to whales. I think the number was 12 to 14% in Area 3. I imagine that would translate to some lower number coastwide. I don't know what the numbers are now. It's fluid, it's dynamic. So those numbers may be different. We just don't know what those numbers are right now. But the rule wasn't made for whales. So it's difficult. It would be difficult getting a recommendation on this rule for whales because the administrative record for this rule was what it was about lobster. The commission may want to, or folks may want to consider that the numbers for whale risk reduction are whatever they are. And the conversation that that Pat referred to earlier, I indicated that depending on the numbers, whether it be it now or later, if there is a gap in the numbers, at some point in time, people are going to have to pay the piper. Just want me to make that clear on the record that that was part of the conversation, depending on the numbers. So I'm not sure where that goes here and how people are considering it, but again, one thing that I do want people to be aware of is that this rule, these addenda were for lobster, and the record for them was about lobster. So while I think it's good to have follow-on measures consider other things, if we're looking to the past and lawyers like to look at the administrative record here on this particular one was about lobster. That's it.
Adam, follow up?
Yeah, so out of that, I hear that the rulemaking process is slow. That's no surprise to any of us. I'm not sure when the interim final rule becomes a final rule. I don't know if the process working slow would mean there's room for us to table this for a meeting until we get some more information, but I wouldn't want that to happen at the cost of the rule becoming final, and then putting us in a position we as the commission didn't want to be in. So I would be willing to make a motion to table this until the spring meeting, but only if I had assurances that we weren't putting ourselves in a position we don't want to be in, and I'm not sure how to get that assurance. I'm just not sure. I understand that the intent here is to do what is more reflective of the current state of management than what these agendas set forth. I'm crystal clear on that. I'm just not clear that this motion gets us to where we want to be in considering all of the other moving parts as we sit here today.
So Ally, if we did not give a recommendation to NOAA until May, what would happen?
This is sort of crystal ball stuff, but the final rule or these regulations would not be, this Chip Lynch with North General Counsel for the record. The regulations are intended to become effective in May 2025. We're in this interim period. It would be helpful to get a sense of where the commission were going. But if we didn't hear until the May meeting, the world isn't going to stop spinning. Again, there are reasons why we need to have an understanding of things going forward. We're in a general election coming up. Getting things through becomes more complicated the later we go, to the extent there are changes, et cetera. I think that's a factor. I mean, but again, the rule isn't going to go final or to be implemented until May of 2025. That's more than a year away.
Thank you, Chip. Dan, I'm going to go to you, and then Adam, I'll come back to you if you want to make a motion. I have Dan and then David on the list, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Tony. Maybe I overemphasized this when I talked about the need for new goals. I'm not trying to avoid the actions because the goals have changed. I'm actually identifying serious flaws in the rules as written that would attempt to accomplish those goals. What I'm getting at is when you dial down, especially in Area 3, if you dial down the trap limits, I can envision a scenario where the vessel owner doesn't have to surrender the traps. They just move those traps to another Area 3 permit that they purchased on the market. So I don't think that the net effect, especially regarding whale conservation, the benefits of this plan are not what you think it is. So that's why I really wanted to let this or send a signal to NOAA not to adopt this and to reconvene these teams to come up with some new objectives and new goals. I hope, and I guess this is a question for Chip, I hope that the mandatory reporting part of the proposed rule wouldn't be also put off, because we need the mandatory reporting part of the proposed rule to be in effect as quickly as possible.
David.
Just a quick point, Mr. Chairman, that I still support going forward with the motion with the provision that I think it's important for us to commit ourselves today to, between now and the next meeting, basically flesh out what our expectations are for the industry going forward. And this could be as simple as doing a tasking memo for the LCMTs. In other words, we do what Dan advocated, is reconstitute the LCMTs and then basically give them a tasking that addresses a lot of the concerns that have been brought up here today. That would be kind of a multifaceted tasking, and then vote on that at the May meeting, and then start that process. I think the important point for everybody here is the point that Chip Lynch made. NOAA put the date of May 1st, 2025 in the rule. So nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to be implemented between now and then. That's my understanding of it. And Chip can correct that if it's wrong. But what that means is we have time to flesh out what we actually intend, and then NOAA will know exactly what we intend to do, and that we intend to pursue a addendum to correct some of the flaws that we seen in the document. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. All right, had some discussion around the table. I think maybe just kind of looking for any additional hands. We've got a motion up on the board. I think it's time to dispense with that motion at this point. I'm kind of looking, making sure nobody flags me down. Okay, I think I'm on the right track. All right, so are there any objections to the motion that is up on the board? Time for a caucus, sorry. So hang on a second, 2 minutes for caucus. 1 minute. 1 minute for a caucus. All right, folks, we hit the minute there. Let's bring it back to the table. Okay, so Ali, did you want to make a comment or, okay. I think I know where you're at, good. Okay, let's see, David's made his way back. So I will now ask the question again. Are there any objections to the motion? Seeing no objections, I see Ally with her hand up, maybe to abstain.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chair. As this is a recommendation to no fisheries, I'll abstain on the motion. Thank you.
Okay, so there are no objections. We have one abstention from Noah. And with that, the motion passes. Shuri.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dennis. Could we take a little break so I could put together a motion for tasking so that we have something on the board to be doing before the May meeting? Unless, Tony, do you have?
What did I do the tracker stuff? And you do
Okay, yep, sounds good, thanks.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Shuri. We'll come back to you. Okay, so where are we? We are up to item 9. This is a progress update on state implementation of addendum. God, what's that? 29 on federal vessel trackers. I'm on here, but I'm going to pass it right to.
Just to clarify the record, Maine is a null.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will give the board a very quick update on trackers. Up on the screen in a hot second, you will see a list of projected implementation dates for states that are putting the vessel tracker regulations of Addendum 27 in place. As a reminder for compliance, all states were to put measures in place by December 15th. Can you get that slide up? Yep. And we have a wide variety of implementation dates as of right now for the states. They vary from the state of Massachusetts implementing these measures in May of this year to some states not implementing until May of 23, and some states not implementing until July of 2024. As we've noted, these tracker data are very important. We've already begun to use the information as Caitlin reported out today for the measures in the closed area, the northern edge. And it's vitally important for these states to get these regulations in place in a timely fashion. Mr. Kelleher, please don't go away. No.
I guess I'm
I have a
supposed to go to
motion.
you.
I think that was prepared for me. I'm sorry for my stepping away from the table. I'm sorry.
Going to you, Pat, for this one.
Evidently.
Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to send states who have not implemented the electronic vessel tracking requirement for the federal lobster permit holders a letter stating that the implementation deadline was for this action was December 15, 2023, and states need to implement the requirement in a timely fashion to ensure compliance with the lobster FMP. Thank you.
Okay, motion by Pat Kelleher. Is there a second to that? Doug Grout, second. Any discussion? Pat or Doug, do you want to say anything further? Head shaking no. Anyone else have anything to say on this motion? Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just clarify for the record that on the table that Tony had just covered a minute ago, it had implementation for the state of Maryland in March of this year. That would be when we would start to work on our rule making, which could take 6 months. But we have every intention to work with the industry with only a few federal permit holders to begin using the trackers, but it won't be enforceable probably until the fall of next year. Late summer, fall. So I just wanted to make sure that's clear.
Thank you, Mike. Maybe I'll just offer a quick comment for Rhode Island. While we didn't get the regulatory piece going yet, we have it planned, and there's actually trackers on vessels in Rhode Island. So we kind of maybe should have done it in reverse order, but lots of trackers on boats in Rhode Island. Was there a hand? Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just for New Jersey, there are some vessels already with trackers, and I'm actually hopeful that we'll have our regulations in place by end of February, but I left it at end of March just to be safe.
Thank you, Joe. Colleen, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point out that the July implementation date we have for our regulations, I think would be the latest case scenario for us. We are working on these measures as part of a bigger regulation package. And coupled with that, we don't have a lot of federal permit holders to begin with. And the one individual who has fished there indicated to me last fall that he's likely going to be putting his permit in CPH. So we may not have any federal permit holders who will need a tracker. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. Okay, we have a motion on the table here. Any further discussion? Any hands online? Okay. I'm going to assume nobody wants to caucus on this, so why don't I go ahead and call the question. Are there any objections to the motion that is up on the board? Not seeing anyone raising their hand here. Any hands online? No hands online, so we will consider that motion passed by unanimous consent. Okay, Tony, anything else?
So one other issue, not on trackers, but so AP. Okay, we'll do the AP. Actually, we'll do the AP stuff and then come back to Cherie. And then I have one issue pertaining to a motion the board passed.
Yep, so before we go to over to Tina for the AP, I'll just note we are skipping the update on the benchmark stock assessment. We'll try and squeeze it into the ISFMP if there's time, but if not, we'll send something out by email. So Tina is ready to go. So Tina, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer for your consideration and approval the nomination of Denny Colbert, offshore commercial trapper from Massachusetts. He replaces Mark Palumbo, who has no longer active in the fishery.
Thank you, Tina. Is anybody okay? Go ahead, Dan.
Can I second that? Oh, is that my motion?
Yes, please.
I make the motion to approve Denny Colbert to the Jonah Crab Advisory Panel.
Is there a second? I see a second from Dennis. So we've got a motion. It's been seconded. I'm going to assume you don't need to caucus. So are there any objections to the motion up on the board? Seeing none here in the room, I'm going to assume no hands online. So that motion passes by unanimous consent. Congratulations to your appointment. Okay, so I think that completes everything on the agenda. And so I'm going to come back now to Cherie. So Cherie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, thanks. I will try and speak slowly, Patty. So I would like to move to have the PDT review the conservation measures originally set in the two addenda 21 and 22, and make recommendations for alternate measures to achieve those reductions, inclusive of a LCMT's recommendations. by the ASMFC spring meeting. The justification.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, go
While
ahead.
they're typing, the justification is to make sure that there is movement forward and that it's not stalled between now and the spring meeting, to assure that we are going to reach the conservation measures initially intended on and be inclusive of the LCMT's input during this process of adjusting these thoughts that we have heard around the table today. Thanks.
Thanks, Sherry. I know the, oh, there it is. Okay, so we've got a motion up on the board made by Sherry Patterson. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Pat Kelleher. Thank you, Pat. Okay, we've already had justification by Sherry. Pat, you want to add anything? Nope. Any discussion on the motion from the board? Joe.
Just a question, and apologies for not on this, but do we need to establish a PDT? Because I know kind of they expire.
There's a question for Tony.
We'll create one.
All right, there you go. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so we got a motion. It's been seconded. Does anybody need time to caucus? Please raise your hand. Oh, I got two people online. Colleen, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a question for our northern neighbors. Does this give them enough time to reconstitute the LCMTs, convene them, and provide comment to the PDT?
I have all the confidence that we have that time.
Okay, so it looks like the answer is yes. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and call the question. Are there any objections to the motion that is up on the board? Please raise your hand. Seeing none around the table. Any online? Okay, no objections to the motion. The motion passes by unanimous consent. Okay, so that was one follow-up, and lucky us, we've got one more follow-up. So go ahead, Tony.
I'm sorry to add complication, but the board previously approved the through an addendum to consider a maximum size of imports. The Lobster FMP is very specific about what can and cannot be done through an amendment or an addendum. Addendums do not have a lot of flexibility in this fishery management plan, so imports would have to be adjusted through an amendment. It's my recommendation that you decouple those two issues and do an addendum for the minimum size and an amendment for the maximum size. It may be that you may want to hold off on the maximum size amendment to hear what the LCMTs come forward with in their shifts. It may be that a recommendation that comes forward for that could be something that might need to be done through an amendment or not, but we could separate those two issues. But in order to address imports, it has to be done through an amendment.
So we passed a motion. I'm not clear on what we need to do at this point with regard to that.
I think we could just clarifying it for the board. Caitlin in her meeting summary will make sure it's very clear that those two issues have to be done through two different processes, and that it's just more direction to staff and whether or not we need a scoping document for May, or if you want us to wait to see if any issues that come out of the action on the board right now would be added to that document or not.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Go ahead, Pat.
Instead of doing this on the fly, could we take time between now and the policy board for the states to figure out what's the best approach and then resolve this at the policy board?
That works, Pat.
Okay. I saw nodding this way. Everyone okay on the other side? Nodding over there as well. Okay. Great. I think that is it. So that completes the agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn this board? Yep, a couple of people made it over there. Is there a second by Jeff? So I'm going to assume there's no objections to that motion. Not seeing any around the table. We are adjourned.